So this poem is called A Herd of Elephants is Sometimes Called a Memory, and has a dedication for A, who once alleged I remember too much of him. If our knowing of each other were an earthly thing, it would be dappled elephant hide, ancient pachyderm skin, stretched taut across mud-cured footpads to receive tiny seismic seizures like tender pen taps. Calls to rejoin the herd so low they rumble unheard past any human. I know that your marriage is dying. I wish to have language strong enough to carve away the sorrow, to mourn together and so low that only we can hear it. Thank you. Thank you for the silence. The golf clap, right? Like I said, the subjects that I tend to write about are not always happy, right? And I have a couple poems here that I wrote last year for my colleague at Delaware County Community College who passed away. So this one is called How I Will Try to Explain Your Death to My Daughters, for Matthew. I will tell them that like raindrops crashing into glass, we are sliding slowly, jerkily downward. We are pulled this way and that by love like magnets. I will remind them that on that last night of celebration, you danced a circle around me, chased my 4-year-old in 8 counts, and I and the baby were your meridian. I will tell them when you are saturated with love, you will leap, miraculous and defiant as Baryshnikov, to become clear and curious water, to return to the humble earth. And this one is, again, kind of for the same lost friend, but a little bit of a different tone, kind of a tongue-in-cheek tone a little bit. So I'm trying to lighten it up a little bit, like a good mixtape, right? We start with the really depressing and then come out of it a little bit. So this is called Why I Am Angry at My Favorite Folk Singer. She's coming to the park near your house in July, and in January, days after your diagnosis, you marked you were interested. I have had no idea you loved her or even liked her, and I wanted to ask you about it, to hold up my love next to yours, watch the light pass through it, quote song lyrics until our mouths ran dry or the beer ran out. But a friend who lost her husband to the same cancer cautioned me, try not to bring the world of the living into the world of the dying. So I held my love away from you. They gave you 2 months in March, and when it came, it was almost to the day. Now it is not yet early June, and the bees have begun filling their hive with sweet, hard work, and I hate her for offering you what you can no longer have. So this next piece is a few years ago we did that, probably one of my last live events, it feels like. We were celebrating the 200th birthday of Walt Whitman. And so everybody was looking for Walt Whitman poems everywhere all of a sudden, much like the kind of reaction after the inauguration, which of course was well-deserved, right? There seem to be kind of ebbs and flows in terms of when people pay attention to poetry in the larger world. And Walt Whitman's birthday was definitely one of those moments, right? So I was thinking about, what I could possibly write that would be an ode to Whitman or Whitman-esque. And I ended up taking one of his pieces and kind of breaking it apart and reconstructing it, which I hope is not blasphemy, but oddly, this was the one that got republished in Verse Daily, to my great shock, I have to say. But so this one is called They're Launching a Poemless Library to the Moon, and it is a reconstructed version of Whitman's As I Ebbed with the Ocean of Life. And it again begins with an epigraph. A private space exploration company is working to send a microfiche library to the moon in 2020. It will include Wikipedia and the Rosetta Project. As I wend to the shore I know not, where the fierce old mother endlessly cries for her castaways, I list to the dirge, the voice of men and women wrecked, amid all the blab whose echoes recoil upon me. aware now that the sediment stands for all the water and all the land of the globe. As I ebbed with the ocean of life, pointing in silence to these songs, oppressed with myself that I have dared to open my mouth, that before all my arrogant poems, the real me stands yet untouched, untold, altogether unreached, me and mine little corpses, you up there walking or sitting, whoever you are. And then I think we're gonna go kind of reverse into some of the oldest of the old work, and then we'll come forward in time, back to the future, right? So this one is called "I'm Not Wanting to Ask Her After Many Weeks of Silence." Pregnancy can be a dark pond, dear friend, that we throw ourselves into. A poem first read as serene by people who love poetry and ponds. But the mirrored surface heaves as we feel ourselves traveling outward. Endlessly, we begin to sink, unsure of our own edges, our companions encased inside us, trying to find the bottom. We hope we will land with a soft thud and safely delivered, but sometimes we scuttle on the mud bank shelf, for a time blanketed in that alluvian loneliness. It is not where the pebble is cast, behind rocks and plants, eddies, that determines this, just how some stones fall. And actually, I guess that's the closest thing I have to a poetry shout out. The people who love ponds and poems are the workshop that we used to be a part of. So, so this one, again, I don't fully know why, but after poetry kind of started taking over my life, postgraduate school, right? So many of my poems had kind of water images in them. And so this is one that fits that bill. It's actually one that I began in graduate school. And I often bring this poem up when some of my students ask me how long it takes to write a poem, which is such a difficult question because, you know, when students are asking, you don't want to always give the true answer, which might be very discouraging. So I hold this one up as an example, and I say, I worked on this poem when I was in graduate school, and I probably rewrote it millions of times, it felt like. And then about 6 years after I had done the bulk of this work, I was walking along the beach in Key West with the man I would eventually marry, the man who's now my husband. And I looked down, and there was a Portuguese man-o-war that had like washed up on shore. I think I even said it out loud. I said, "That's the image that my poem needs." And I of course, you know, brought in my head, not actually in my baggage, but I brought the man-of-war home, right? And he ended up in this poem. So the poem is called "Postcard to His Wife." How long he kept your name for himself. The sea reaches for the smooth breast of the shore and turns away. Now the ocean comes back to me in all my poems. Here the wind whirls your name into crescendo, where we lay awake in sandy arsenals. He talked about moving inland. I must have laughed. Now the pipers pick over the man of war, washed of his armor and shuddering plum dye, all that is left of this cup of new Narcissus, who was a fool to have settled for the pond when he could have run into the sea, embracing hundreds of mollusk admirers who might die and rot and still call after him. They pine for their first love down to chiseled bone. I wished I'd been a monument when I heard him say, "I've met someone." Instead, I read and reread the indictment of the tide, slapping the stage shore, wishing to grow gills and drown kissing air. Then you could cut along my ribs and pry me open, find flecks of mercury winking, to know that he had flown. And I just want to be conscious of time here. Thank you. This is probably, I guess, one of the oldest pieces I'll read tonight. And again, it's a reconstructed bit. as you may have noticed, I tend to write kind of in two veins, pretty narrative and kind of, you know, almost like conceptual, right? So this is kind of the furthest I go on the conceptual spectrum. Thank you so much, everybody. And this is both an erasure and a collage. So I took stuff out of an existing document and then I put stuff in, right? So this is erasure collage memory from an online interview and emails received between April 24th and May 5th. It may be a long way, but on a good day, it's where the work gets done, analyzed. It's a curious thing to discover everything, and as we know, his discharge date keeps changing. Morgan is still in the hospital amid all that, mild, expressive, doctors are not very clear, heels side by side and humming. Sometimes with their explanations of words that are similar in meaning, such as cat for dog, or similar in sounds, foot for phone. But that was exactly, to us, what we already knew. As of now, it might be this Wednesday, everyone flocks together. Once you get outside, the scenes popping up, he's still a bit disoriented, especially at night, and occasionally during the day. Probably the only errors made are sometimes secret because he just hasn't mentioned anything. Hasn't mentioned any more of the hallucinations recently you realized last night driving late and the whole city transformed. We passed constellations of what keeps you in. I think we've been really lucky that we're a city of misfits, close-knit. We have such a strong connection. We grew up, but it's still sometimes difficult, not trying to be invented. And yesterday, after a few days of declining mental insularity, becomes clear he will be heading directly to hospice care. Hubble discovered that the universe was out there with the cancer all over his lungs as well as in his lymph nodes 1 month before, just that 1 month, when there was nothing else, only a freeway and a garden like us. No one knows what this means in regards to the future. Everyone always says to us, concentrate quietly, God, maybe we don't need to come back together and to breathe, to figure out what kind of cells there are. We happened to be the memories, color, and that. Maybe there are just some things you ought to say out loud together. So in the time that remains, I thought that I would test out, so you all are my guinea pigs tonight, some, hopefully it's a safe thing here, right? Some new work, and I am currently working on a series that started probably as, I know they started as creative nonfiction pieces. Because I began doing some creative nonfiction work at the beginning of last year. And then, of course, I brought them to my workshop being like, are these anything? And they were like, they are a thing and they're poems, right? So, of course, you know, trust poets to find the hidden poem in my stuff. So, so this series is, well, the kind of, I guess, the unifying theme or structure is that I'm going through things that I cannot get rid of in my house. And a good friend of mine is a KonMari consultant. And of course, I've been trying to like absorb her philosophy, and yet, right? I read somewhere that creative nonfiction writers are the pack rats of the literary world. I think maybe that's what appeals to me about it, is that, you know, as a poet, I sometimes have to throw things out, but as a CNF writer, I do not, right? And yet, like I said, these came back into poetry world. So all of these things are kind of focused on objects, and the thing that unites them is that they begin with kind of museum tags. Like if you can picture when we used to walk through museums, those little signs next to the paintings, and I looked up, you know, what each line on the museum tag means, and so I won't read all of that tonight, except to say that things that you do need to know is that all of these start off with the artist of the thing, a title, which I will be reading, a short description of the thing, which I, again, will be reading, dimensions, the place that the thing came from, and then kind of like an acquisition number. So you'll hear me kind of start off with the part of the museum tag that I'm reading and then jump into the poem. And like I said, I think I will, yeah, the time that remains, I'll focus on these. So this one is titled Still Good Rice Cooker, circa 1978. Glazed avocado green steel with nested electronics, black handles, replaced wooden top. Second generation Chang family collection. It might have had a name, an older sibling when I was growing up. Its pale green body and distinctive flick of beetles' wings closing that I hear 3 rooms away. The handle my father carefully replaced at least twice, chanting still good under his breath, plods along, making rice that never burns, and forms a bubbled, cracked skin on the inside lip where the belly meets the lid. When I was small, I remember waiting for the metal to cool and peeling away the starched shed skin in strips, the crack and rustle so satisfying. My father passed it to me when I left his home for college. I swear he would have buckled it into a seatbelt if I hadn't been watching. So I think, thank you. I think I'll just read 2 more from that short series before I wrap up here. So this one, I'm not certain that this is the title of this piece, but I'm gonna say I'm calling it Other People's Houses. And this is poured glass with embossed Pierre Smirnoff label in red, white, and gold. And it's a gift from the Ludmilla Foster collection. Maybe she was out of practice giving gifts, but I cannot imagine what moved my mother's Russian aunt to bring my temperate parents horseradish vodka, except to share a piece of her irrecoverable self. It outlived her presence in their house. My father, so tired of the bulks of visiting vodka drinkers, he scrawled horseradish 3 times in Sharpie on the embossed label in his neat hand. On my mother-in-law's first visit to my parents' home, she ran her fingers across the label's marred face and whispered, "What a shame, that's a collector's item." And I didn't know if I was meant to hear her. And I'll finish with this one, which is called It's a Lamp, Charlie Brown. Ceramic Snoopy lamp base with plastic nightlight balloons, 2 missing, strings cut, topped with ivory paper lampshade, printed with pictures of Peanuts characters flying kites. Second generation Chang family collection. My father says, my mother says, we bought it from a store a few doors down from his first office job. I always wondered if it came from my grandparents, who sent Schultz crib sheets from Hawaii, paying whatever astronomical price to ship printed cotton so many miles as a declaration of their wishes for me, that I might be uncomplicated, docile, faithful. Then I arrived and I was none of those things, but I don't remember snubbing Snoopy or his ceramic sidekick as I grew. I do remember gazing at the balloons that never rose, while my mother recounted that my classmate in the hospital might die from 3rd-degree burns, and how I cried and wished aloud that it could have been me instead, grief flowing out of me and into the balloon's empty chambers. In 7th grade, Snoopy toppled from my highboy dresser, shattering 2 of those balloons that had stayed inflated and illuminated for so much of my childhood. I recall the sound like a sternum cracking. My father claims he bumped the lamp one night while we were disagreeing, but all I can remember now is picking up the shards, fallen like scattered eggshells, with "my fault, my fault, my fault," echoing inside my head. Thank you so much, everyone.